This episode of the Danger Close podcast is brought to you by Cry Havoc. From New York Times #1 best-selling author, Jack Carr. Cry Havoc, a Tom Rees thriller. Order now.
China.
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 China. China wants to make a deal.
China is the biggest threat to the US as the dominant superpower since the Soviet Union.
There's no way that China can retaliate in a way that doesn't do much more damage to their own economy than to ours.
Xi's saying that his nation is, quote unquote, not afraid, and also warning, quote, there are no winners in a trade war, and going against the world will only lead to self-isolation.
The ball is in China's court. China needs to make a deal with us. We don't have to make a deal with them. There's no difference between China and any other country except they are much larger. And China wants what we have, what every country wants what we have, the American consumer. Or to put it another way, they need our money.
By mentioning that China now is a one-man show. Chairman Xi has completely gutted the system of any decision maker. So anytime you evaluate the concept of a war, you have to look at it from his personal view and not the Chinese national view, because those are two very different things. And the Chinese national view is now completely slave to what Xi thinks. And Xi has destroyed the bureaucracy's capacity to transmit and gather information. So he is making decisions in the dark a lot. And now he's working on gutting the political power and the economic power of the military as well. So even if this goes like a perfect reform professionalization system, it's going to be 20 years before the Chinese military is ready to function in a way that we would consider a military functioning. It has a lot more in common probably with the Russian military right now than any overarching fear. So that's kind of to the side. Two big problems. Number one, China is the most wired country in the world in terms of its international involvement. It imports almost all of its raw materials. It imports almost all of its energy. It's the world's largest importer of food, and it imports 80% of the inputs it needs to grow its own food. So if something happens to the international system, like, I don't know, the United States deciding that it's done maintaining the international system, it's over. And you get a deindustrialization collapse and a famine that kills half the population without a shot being fired. Or there's a demographic problem. 45 years after the one-child policy, and combined with the world's fastest ever urbanization program, the average birth per woman has now dropped below 1, which means we are looking at the end of China being able to maintain any sort of workforce or consumption base in less than 10 years, meaning that the Chinese system in its current form will collapse and will probably result in an deindustrialization collapse that also generates a famine that kills half the population. These are now the base scenarios for the Chinese system. That assumes nothing goes wrong, that assumes that Xi doesn't miscalculate, that assumes no uprising, no wars, no international trade dispute, and all of these are on dock. So we are looking at the end of the CCP-run Chinese system soon. 5 years ago, Xi knew this. I don't think he realized just how deep the trajectory was. I don't think any of us did. And the information that's come out just in the last 2 weeks is truly damning. We've seen their birth rate now, by their own data, drop by more in the last 6 years than what happened to the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust. So national death is upon us. But this isn't the first time China's died. By my math, this is the 28th civilizational collapse. we think of China as being around forever, but China, the geography has. China as a government rises, over-centralizes, spins apart, collapse, a third of the population dies, and they start over. The difference this time is everyone's moved from the farm to the city, and there aren't enough farmers. So a 50% drop in the population is probably over-optimistic. Now, if you're the CCP and you actually have a grip on the situation, which is not clear anymore if they do, betting that there's going to be a 29th option on the other side of these dark days plays to history. It might not be right this time around because the fall is going to be a lot worse, but you're not going to bet that your country is going to disappear from history completely. And if you can pre-position what's left of the CCP to rule that new incarnation, now's the time to come up with a clever plan. And so if you can command the narrative of a war, even if you know you're going to lose, it's worth some serious consideration. If you know you're going to lose half the population anyway, you might as well make some hay of it.
And you think that's an unlikely scenario?
I don't want to say it's unlikely or not because it requires a degree of inhuman thinking I'm not comfortable with. And more importantly, it has to come from one person who's riding this tiger into the ground and knowing what Xi thinks is now impossible because he doesn't have conversations with anyone. So we could station a CIA asset 5 feet away from him from now until the end of time, and we'd have no idea what the plans are until they were actually issued. He has no confidence. He's either killed them all, pushed them out of government, arrested them, exiled them, they're gone. He's not surrounded by yes men. Yes men speak. He's surrounded by silent men.
And when you say you're uncomfortable thinking through that type of scenario, is that because of the amoral aspects of it?
Well, it's the amoral aspects of it, and just think what step 2 is. If this is the decision, if this is something that makes the Cultural Revolution look ethical, you know, the deliberate destruction of 500 million plus people in order for the thin reed of hope that 30 years from now, your ideological descendants might be in charge, that requires a combination of brutality and hope that usually don't coexist in the same mind. American demographics goes boomers, Xers, millennials, Zoomers.
Interesting.
Everyone else in the world goes boomers, Xers, millennials, Zoomers.
Wow.
The one thing that our baby boomers did differently is they had kids.
Huh.
That didn't happen in most places. So we're looking at the end of economics as we understand it today, whether you call it your favorite economic theory is socialism or fascism or communism or capitalism. Those don't work in a world where the population's in collapse. We've got to figure out something new. But in the United States and in Mexico, the two healthiest demographies in the world, we have bare minimum another 35 years. So we got to watch everyone else wrestle with this while we continue with business as normal and just kind of see if there are any tricks that we can pick up along the way.
Interesting. And what about our dependence on China just for stuff, like probably what I'm talking to you on right here, maybe pharmaceuticals, tech, all that sort of a thing. How does that impact if China implodes, or how does that impact us? Or we just adapt? Where it's like, hey, we can do that stuff here. We just have chosen not to over the past 50 years.
For most things, I think we're going to be fine. The United States is the least integrated major power in the global economy in the world, and that's by design. We created globalization to build an alliance to fight the Soviets. So if we had been the dominant economic power in that, it wouldn't have worked. So we basically informally agreed to run massive trade deficits, and globalization has been successful in integrating 2 economic sectors from the United States and the wider world. Only 2. One of those is agriculture, because our farmers and ranchers are just so ridiculously productive that they have to sell outside of the United States. So based on whether you're a farmer or rancher, you're in pork or corn or whatever, there's going to be some adjustments that are going to be uncomfortable. Manufacturing is the second one, specifically tech manufacturing. What makes tech manufacturing work is having access to multiple different pools of labor at different skill levels and different price levels, so that every specific part can be made in a place with maximum competitive advantage. And then you shuttle it to the next spot to add the next piece. And in that, China has been great. China is not exactly a one-stop shop, but you've got
technocracies right across the water in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. You've got countries that are poorer like Vietnam and Indonesia nearby. And so you can have a great system, and tech has outsourced their entire manufacturing base to this part of the world. That's where we're going to feel it. Because that's going to break. You don't rebuild that overnight. And the Mexicans are wonderful, but in northern Mexico, there's only 30 million Mexicans. So there's a limit to how much of this that we can build before we can figure out a new, more automated way of doing the construction. So between now and 2030, that's going to probably be the biggest pinch in our system, is just computing and cell phones and electronics, fax machines, servers, all that kind of stuff. That all has to come back. It is all coming back, but you have to unwind 40 years of globalization in a very short period of time. We need to, bare minimum, double our industrial plant in the next 5 years. And while that will end us in a much better place than where we are now, the road from there is going to be bumpy, and there's going to be a lot of inflation because this stuff isn't free to build.
But what's very attention-getting to me is the fact that China is now saying it's not going to raise tariffs any higher, saying it has other weapons, almost making fun of the United States for raising the stakes, raising the numbers so high. Let me share with you some remarks we got late today from a government official here in Beijing who said that the United States is engaging in nothing more than a numbers game with no real economic significance, going on to say the United States is exposing itself as a participant in weaponizing tariffs, as a tool of bullying and coercion, turning itself into a joke.
And I think that if he holds out for too long, the Chinese economy could go over the cliff. We are seeing factories closing. We're seeing unemployment rising. Workers are going back to the farms. This is a very bad story for China. But Xi Jinping, he wants to tough it out because he has put himself in a position where he can't do the economically rational thing.
All right. Well, I have you 2 last general questions here. Sure. You write that more than war or disease, famine is the ultimate country.
God, you're getting all the happy questions.
I end on a happy one.
Yeah.
What does the next 50 years of food shortages look like? We've talked about it a little bit with China, but for the rest of the world, how does that impact the rest of the world?
Sure. It's ultimately a supply chain issue that's causing it. So if you're going to build, a refrigerator and you can't get the compressor into the last second, you're just left with the paperweight, but then you plug in the compressor, even if it's a year later, and you have a refrigerator. It's not how food production works. You have to have the tractor available, fueled, and ready to go during planting season and harvest season. You have to have the finance ready before planting season so you can afford the seed, which has its own supply chain that has to be ready by February. You're not going to be able to plant in March and April. Fertilizer has to go on a specific time. Pesticide has to go on a specific time. The labor for harvest and processing has to be available at a specific time. And if every single one of those pieces is not in place in the perfect time, it all falls apart and you don't have a harvest. And you don't wait a month or 2 months for it to come together. You have to wait a minimum until the next planting season. So it is by far the most vulnerable economic sector to disruptions. You break down manufacturing from, say, a China break, there goes most of the world's agricultural equipment. You have a problem with, say, the Houthis in the Red Sea or the Iranians in the Persian Gulf, there goes the fuel. You have a problem with the Russians, there goes the potash. You have a problem with the global natural gas sector, there goes the nitrogen fertilizer, and on and on and on and on. So we're probably looking at only about roughly 1/3 of the world's agricultural supply chain systems being low risk to risk free. And most of that is Anglo-America, with Mexico helping out with some of the manufacturing. So in North America, we look pretty good. Everywhere else looks pretty fucked. And the Chinese system is by far the most concerned because they're the biggest importer of most of the things that allow them to grow the food anyway. So rebuilding the supply chains to feed the 5 billion people that don't have reliable supply chains is going to take longer than the 5 billion people are going to have. And the places I'm most worried about from a production point of view are Brazil, which has the lowest quality agricultural land of any of the major producing zones and produces very, very few of the inputs itself, and China, where they've plowed under their good land for urbanization. And what's left is the most input intensive agricultural zones we have. So that's on the input side. On the outputs, I'm sorry, that's on the production side. On the consumption side, people needing to eat, China. There's no way we get out of this this half century with more than 1 billion Chinese. I'd be of a secondary concern on South Asia. The Indians are fairly capable. They produce some of their own fertilizer, and they haven't industrialized to the degree that a lot of other countries have. So there are a lot of subsistence farmers out there who won't starve. Pakistan, though, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, those all look really ugly. The Middle East imports most of its inputs and most of its food. That's really ugly. So those 3 regions I'd probably switch the order: China, Middle East, South Asia. That's where we're going to feel the pain the most. And I'd be very surprised if we make it to 2050 with only 1 billion fewer people than we have now.
Introducing the BCM Stock Mod 3 and Marksman Risers. Built from years of real-world experience, the BCM Mod 3 stock is the next evolution in M4 accessories. Minimalist, snag-free, and just 6.4 ounces with double-walled H-beam construction for unmatched durability. Paired with the Mark III Marksman Risers in 0.5 and 0.8 inches. The Mod 3 offers total customization with 6 mounting positions and forward or reverse orientation. It delivers a consistent cheek weld for passive night vision or CQB. For high-ready weapons manipulation, it features a removable diamond textured butt pad, non-slip grip panels, and a quick adjust design with integrated sling attachment points. Plus, its patented internal latch system and ergonomic lever ensure rugged performance with tool-free installation. Proudly made in the USA, the BCM Mod 3 stock, built to outlast and outperform. Get yours now at BravoCompanyUSA.com.
While Trump's trade war targets China, Taiwan's deeply integrated tech industry could become unintended collateral damage.
Many now see this as the start of a major supply chain realignment, and the first priority is to get out of China. With U.S. tariffs on Chinese electronics expected to soar over 140%, staying put just isn't an option anymore. I'm told that even relocating to Vietnam or Thailand, where tariffs could still reach 40%, is still a better deal. Now, the second focus is building a footprint in America. Companies are increasingly seeing the need to produce directly in the U.S. It's not just about tariffs, of course. It's about securing future access to the U.S. market. I'm also hearing that Mexico could be a big winner as companies look for alternatives closer to the U.S.
So what does Taiwan give them if they were to retake
nothing?
That really?
Yeah, so China, about the only advantage would be a mild strategic advantage because Taiwan is part of the first island chain, and those line of barrier islands that are populated that separate China from the rest of the world. And China's never been able to penetrate through that in a sustained way, certainly not in a corporate manner. But they don't get semiconductors because the Chinese can't operate their own semiconductors. So if they suddenly found themselves in possession of the world's most advanced system, they wouldn't know what to do with it. It would be like a spaceship landing in the United States. And, we'd give it a good try, but we wouldn't have any idea what we're doing. It would lead to a military conflict that they couldn't win. Remember, the Chinese Navy, while it has a lot of vessels, under combat conditions, most, over 80%, can only sail about 400 miles from shore. And their oil comes from 5,000 miles away. So someone, Japan, the United States, Australia, Taiwan, Vietnam, India, someone will put 2 destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and cut the energy line. And that is literally all she wrote. Also remember that China is the world's largest importer of food, and they import the vast majority of the inputs that allow them to grow their own. So you'd be looking at a deindustrialization collapse that would trigger a famine in a matter of months. And as of 4 years ago, the Chinese government realized that. There's an open question now with Xi purging the system so much of whether or not he actually buys into the propaganda. We just don't know. One of the beautiful, beautiful things of the Ukraine war is the United States has demonstrated that it's listening in to every meeting and every phone call and reading every email and every blog that Putin touches. You can't do that with Xi because he doesn't speak with anyone. There's no one to hack. So we just don't know.
Oh man, he's gone old school. What does it do to us if there's a prolonged conflict over Taiwan? Does it do something to our semiconductor industry, like maybe make it revitalize it here? Or are we looking at that anyway?
Yes and no. So semiconductors are a really, really messy space. You've got three main types. You've got your 10 nanometer and smaller. Those are your super advanced ones. Those are used in most AI programs. So that would include things like satellites. That would include things like self-driving. At the bottom, you've got your 90 nanometers and bigger. And these are almost analog chips. They can only do like one or two things. So like the chip that's in your smart bulbs would be one of those. And then in the middle, 90 to 10, everything else, that's the vast bulk of the market. And that's everything from aerospace to automotive to power regulation. The really, really good stuff, the top 10%, requires a constellation of almost everyone, 13 different countries. So you're getting lenses from the Germans, light sources from the Californians, laser etching systems from the Dutch. The wafer fabrication comes from the Japanese. Americans do the design, and they're manufactured in primarily Taiwan and to a lesser degree Korea. And if a single country falls out of that constellation, none of it works because there is no backup for any of it.
Okay.
So if we do have a war in Taiwan that is meaningful in any way, we lose the good chips. And that means AI goes into a winter for at least a decade.
Dang. That's wild.
On the low end, the 90 and bigger, the dumb chips, those are almost exclusively China.
Okay.
So when China goes, no matter how China goes, we lose the Internet of Things and everything that comes from that. Everything in the middle is actually significantly more durable. The chips aren't as advanced. Their production comes from different places. There's some in Europe, there's some in Japan, there's some in South Korea, there's a lot in the United States. In fact, by value, the United States By value, the United States produces more chips than the rest of the world put together. Those 10 nanometer and higher, those are really expensive chips, but there's just not a lot of them. And the 90 nanometer and below, there's a lot of them, but they're just not very expensive. So everything in the middle for your cars, for your planes, and so on, we're probably okay with a China meltdown or even a Taiwanese capture or destruction. That doesn't mean it's immune to all the shocks that are going on out there. There's a lot, especially with the Ukraine war, I'm concerned about. But we're not really worried about the infrastructure or the industrial plant. And, you know, in this world, that's about as good as the news gets.
Jeez, I know the title of your book wouldn't suggest this, but you are actually hopeful about the future when it comes to the United States in particular.
We're going to be really good. I mean, we're pretty good now. We're already the world's largest economy, highest standard of living, energy secure, food secure, blah, 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 blah. 10 years from now, once we've built out the industrial plant to replace a lot of these places like China that are falling away, we're also going to have lower costs of production and more secure production and higher employment. And the employment here will be fueling the factories that are selling the products to the people who are consuming here, and will be broadly immune to international shocks. This is a good story. But the path from here to there, there are a lot of bumps, and it is not great.
Mexico is the next China. Now, politically, is it the next China? I don't know, but it's going to become a manufacturing hub of the likes. If it does things well, it's going to become the manufacturing hub of the next 50 years. And the U.S.'s foreign policy in Mexico has been horrible. It has. We've just discovered that at least 3 former Mexican presidents were on the payroll of the CIA, for example, with documents being declassified. And I suspect as we go along, most of the presidents in the 80s are also going to be revealed to be CIA bankrolled presidents in Mexico. So as far as this being a Mexico problem because of their corruption, and as far as the Mexican people just not being willing to do shit, the U.S. needs to get the Americans, and I include myself, because I pay taxes here now, and it's I'm part of this experiment. We all need to get our heads out of our asses and realize that this is a regional problem. It's no longer a Mexico or a U.S. problem. It's a regional problem, and we are very much responsible for a big part of it. Yes, they do have the responsibility, but we are also responsible in a big way. As far as the designation of them being terrorists, well, you have a foreign entity that is not friendly to U.S. interest and or U.S. Policy abroad. that very much has their hand in Mexico. And that is not a theory. That is not a possible thing. That is very much true. To anybody who wants to look at it, that's just how it is.
With all my books, I start with a theme, with a premise, and for The Devil's Hand, it was really about what the enemy has learned by watching us at that time on the field of battle for about 20 years. So I'm starting to write this in early 2020. COVID-19 hits. Enemy is certainly learning something from our response to COVID. Then we hit a summer of civil unrest. Enemy, once again, is looking at that. They're drawing lessons. And then moving a very contentious election cycle. Enemy's learning from that as well. So all of those very current events got woven into the novel. In The Devil's Hand, Reese is carrying the SIG P365 XL. In this chapter, Reese is meeting with the Secret Service in advance of meeting the president. Sorry, I have to ask, are you armed? Pistol and blade, Reese said. I'll have to ask you to transfer them to your bag and leave it with us. You'll be meeting the president alone. Normally being disarmed made Reese extremely nervous, but this was anything but a normal situation. Of course, Reese responded, removing his holster and weapon from the appendix carry position. He wanted to ask additional questions, but held his tongue. Is that the XL? Sharp asked, admiring Reese's choice of weapon. Yeah, I've been running it for a few months with the red dot, and I have to say, I'm a fan. I've had my eye on one, but the missus thinks I have too many already. I've refrained from telling her she has a closet full of shoes that cost more and all look the same. Wise man, Reese acknowledged as he unclipped the MTAC Northman blade from his pocket. And this is the SIG P365 XL. This is the one that came out around the time that I was writing the book, right there with a red dot optic. And I haven't put enough time on the red dot optic myself to have one of these be my daily carry. I still like the old irons just because I have so much time on the irons. But as I was writing this book, my intent was to put a little more time on the range with the red dot. That hasn't happened yet because I continue to write books. If I was to write this again, would he still carry the XL? There's so many more options out there now than there were when I wrote this. And you can go to the SIG custom shop, build your own, or you can just pick any 365 that you want. So the XL is an option. This is the one that I carry pretty much every day right here. And this is just the regular P365. There it is, right there. Super compact. Absolutely love this pistol. Or you could go for something a little different. You can go to the Custom Works shop on the SIG website and get something like this. And this is one where you choose the grip mod, you choose the barrel, the slide, the magazine, the optic. So that would have been an option for James Reese, or something like this. And this is the X Macro, P365 X Macro. And this thing, that is a sweet pistol. So that could have been an option for James Reese. Probably at the time, if this had been out, he would have done this. Or something else, a custom P365 from the guys at True Precision, like this one right here. This is a sweet pistol. So check that out. True Precision, that would have been an option. But I really like light rifles for some reason and heavy pistols. And this is the Legion P365. And this, that is a solid pistol. That is heavier right there than the others. And for me, I do love the heavy pistol. Many people fear that a war with China may be coming, but the war is already here. This is not a shooting war with boots on the ground, fighters flying overhead, or Navy destroyers pummeling the coastline. American soldiers and Marines are not dying on battlefields. Cities are not being bombed. It is a war, nevertheless, with massive civilian casualties that is decimating our social stability, if not actual buildings. It's again going to defeat the United States without firing a shot.
The United States has been fighting a war with China, unbeknownst to most of the public, for a while. It's apparent to people like myself who have actually witnessed the amount of fentanyl being pumped into Mexico through its Pacific side ports, where the cartel that had access to those Pacific side ports grew during COVID, which is pretty funny and also alarming, the New Generation Cartel. While the Sinaloa cartel was smuggling fentanyl from the U.S. into Mexico to load their drugs to then send back up. So that should tell something to the American populace. Chinese banking apps are being utilized to move money for cartels from the U.S. from Canada to Mexico. So their Chinese banking apparatus has been utilized and weaponized against the United States, U.S. interest in when it comes to this type of threat for a while now. Fentanyl precursors that make meth, precursors that are used for a lot of other drugs, all come from China. There is no Chinese triad mafia doing this undercover without the Chinese state knowing about it, number one. There is nothing coming out of China without China knowing about it. And they have been making a big effort to pump a shit ton of fentanyl into your country for years now. So that should be a factor where people take into consideration as far as declaring their proxy groups, which I think at least one of them has all the telltale signs of being a proxy group of a sort, you know. If somebody wanted to do the math and figure out how many of those Chinese Norinkos are showing up in some places in Mexico and where they're showing up and in what hands, I think the math will match up to some of the stuff that I'm saying.
Yeah.
I think there's a big effort being done, and Mexico is basically it's our current modern version of Vietnam, where two foreign powers are basically fighting it out in a foreign country. Mexico is an example of that.
How does that relationship work between what's going down in South America, how they're getting up to Mexico through Central America, waterways, shipping, ports, and then into the United States versus demand now and the push for fentanyl?
Yeah.
Tactically, what do you see as far as movement goes? Has that evolved over time?
I mean, when I started, it was meth was the biggest thing, you know, meth production, cocaine, marijuana, weed, you know, which is hilarious to me now because every now and then I, light up. So it is what it is. But it's, you saw, that's what you would see, and mostly catered to an American audience, American market, just basically moving some of these things up. I think the first big change that I saw was towards the end of the whole prescription pain medication epidemic, opiate epidemic we saw in this country. You know, it subsided, and then there was a bunch of people that were addicted to that shit who said, like, now what? Now what do we take? So there was this gap there.
Okay,
it's perfect hole. That paired with the legalization of marijuana in other parts of the country, California, for example, that was sold to us as a whole. Hey, we're going to legalize marijuana. It's just a plant. It's fun. It's great. And I do agree with it. I have nothing against marijuana use. I think it's benign as shit. You know, probably like anything, if you abuse it, it'll probably create some sort of psychosis, and it's not completely benign. But for pain relief, chilling out, for just getting a craving for cookies, it's fine, right? They legalize it, but they sell it as, oh, this is going to be a death blow for cartels because now they don't have this money, you know? But, people like my friend John Norris, who have been hunting cartel guys, growing this illegally in the United States in public lands, is aware of this. A lot of those first weed companies had already cartel influences in them because those were the guys that were running growing operations in the area. So they just basically shifted to legal work and invested a shit ton of money into their pockets and kept up the illegal growth. So they didn't do anything realistically to cut cartel influence. Yeah. But what you saw in the South, in Mexico, what we saw was all these weed fields were now being shifted over to poppy.
Okay.
Because they said, well, weed isn't anymore a producer. Let's put poppy here. So you started seeing these poppy fields down there. The problem with these hillsides that there have been I'm not too sure about it, but this is what I've heard from their growers and some of them that we caught. They would say that the ground was leached of nutrients, and there was not the potency of the heroin produced from these Mexican poppy plants was not the same as some of the stuff you would get from other parts of the world. At the start of my career, I found a giant ball of black tar heroin about that big. And if you ever seen any of that shit, you can smell it before you see it. After that, I never saw that color of heroin again. It was always light brown heroin, powdery. Somebody told them that if they infuse it with fentanyl, it would make it a hit with the consumer. Now, who that was and who came up with that idea? Well, this is all during the time when Chinese chemists are basically setting up laboratories within legal, regulated pharmaceutical industry in Mexico. People can look up Sen Ji Legon, Mexican Chinese industrialist who was caught with $100 million at his house.
Wow.
And to just figure out what he was into, pharmaceutical industry. So you started to see fentanyl laced heroin being flooding the U.S. market. That's the evolution that I first saw.
Yeah.
And now you're seeing them shift to pain medication, being clone pain medication, and also infusing everything with fentanyl. Cocaine markets are stable because these cartels are now established all the way down in Colombia. You'll go to Colombia, go places like Medellin, and you'll have cartel-specific distributors, and their Mexicans are all the way down there. You saw Mexicans try and set up growth operations in other parts of South America. They're not Colombia, trying to get them a bit more north, trying to figure that out. All the while, they've expanded their influence in places like North Africa, Southeast Asia, China, for example. Not that they're there operating, but they're there, gathering and meeting people probably, and all over Europe. So the influence of these criminal organizations has expanded in an insane way over the years. As far as what they're into, I mean, anything that is, I think the current trend is fentanyl laced everything. Pill presses are being found all over the country. Packaging. An Imodium package that has all the Imodium pills, but that's not Imodium. The pain medication being manufactured to look like, oh, this is, one of those feel-good pills that they give you at the VA, but it's not. It looks like it, but then you'll end up dead the next day. That's a lot of the deaths attributed to fentanyl right now in the United States. Legit, many of those people didn't know what they were taking.
Wow.
I was in Cleveland and heard the story about these 3 teenagers doing cocaine for the first time, and guess what was in the cocaine? Yeah. Those 3 kids got buried a few days later, and they were just fucking idiot kids,
Yeah.
I remember when you would find a joint on the ground and you'd be like, oh shit, this is the greatest day ever. Now there's no fucking way you're gonna smoke that thing. Well, you don't know what's in it, It is a dangerous and very dangerous time to be young.
Yeah.
Like, it's one of the most dangerous time in history.
Yeah.
And in one of the most dangerous places in the world, I guess, to be a kid, which is, as a society, I like to consider myself an American, and I'm a permanent resident of this country. I'm paying taxes. I want full citizenship. I'm trying to get there. It's a matter of time more than anything. To all the people shitting on this country as far as it being a bad place, a racist place, whatever you want to say, there are less enemies to that freedom in this country than anywhere else in the world. That's why everybody's coming here. And the world itself is becoming less and less influenced by American, that American specific mindset, that good guys versus bad guys. We want to make everything better. We want to better things out there for people. The U.S. is retracting itself, and globalism is on its way out. And this isolationism that we started encountering, I think, after Trump, and I get the nationalist aspect of it, and I get his need to make America great again. I don't take me wrong. I understand what he's pushing and what people respond as far as his politics. But there's a giant time bomb on our southern border, and several small ones in the United States already. And I think that's what's coming ahead if people don't wake up to this fact. It's not about politics, left or right. There's a reason why this whole talk about Mexicans being a terrorist organization is bipartisan in nature. I mean, people are waking up to this fact.
Yeah.
Whatever conflict is coming is probably going to happen on that southern border.
Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that in 2021 alone claimed more than 67,000 lives. That is more than American combat deaths in the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam combined. Fentanyl is now the leading cause of death of Americans under the age of 45. It has killed more Americans in a single year than were killed in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. All evidence points to fentanyl being intentionally deployed. Fentanyl is being covertly and systematically aimed at the citizens of our country by a major foreign power, the most lethal peacetime attack in human history. Yet, when President Biden meets with the president of China, they don't even talk about fentanyl.
Yeah, no, it's. I think there are a couple of big misnomers about fentanyl. The first is that it's like, heroin or cocaine. It's a drug addiction problem. It's not. Most of the people, the vast majority of people that die of fentanyl overdoses don't even know they're taking fentanyl. It's some college kid who, is borrowing an Adderall from a friend because he's trying to study for an exam. It's a counterfeit Adderall. He takes it. It's got fentanyl in it. He dies. Nobody understands what's going on until the autopsy. That's the first big misnomer. The second one is that this is all about the Mexican drug cartels. The Mexican drug cartel, as far as I'm concerned, and I think the evidence is overwhelming, they're the junior partners here. Just trace every link in the chain. The precursor chemicals that go into making fentanyl, 90% of them are produced in China. 90% of them end up in the port of Manzanillo in western Mexico. Who controls that port? Not a Mexican company, not an American company, a Chinese company. And that's why, lo and behold, they can never find out where this stuff is. When the precursors are then moved to northern Mexico to be turned into fentanyl, according to our Department of Homeland Security, there are 2,000 Chinese nationals living in northern Mexico working for the drug cartels to actually create this deadly cocktail that becomes fentanyl. Yeah. Now they've got the pure fentanyl. They need a delivery system. They need the pills, right? Because people are taking pills. They don't know they're taking fentanyl. So the drug cartels, they need pill presses, big industrial pill presses, and they need pill molds, those little molds so that the pill actually looks like a Vicodin or like an Adderall. Where do they get those from? Again, the Department of Homeland Security says they get those from China, and the Chinese are selling them to the Mexican drug cartels at cost. In other words, they're not trying to gouge them. They're not trying to make a bunch of money on this. So now they produce the pills. You're running a drug cartel. You're smuggling this stuff across the Mexican U.S. border. You need secure communications when you're distributing this stuff in the United States. You don't want law enforcement eavesdropping on your communications. So what do the Mexican drug cartels do? They use Chinese apps and they use Chinese encrypted communication devices because they know China will not share those communications with U.S. law enforcement. And then the final element of it is the money laundering. Every drug cartels needs to launder money. In the days when it was cocaine or heroin, they laundered their money in Latin American banks. They now have shifted to Chinese state-owned banks because the rates are better, they're more efficient. And again, according to our law enforcement, they oftentimes are using Chinese students in the United States on education visas to actually carry out the money laundering for them. So, as I said, the Mexican drug cartels are the junior partners here. They're making bank. They're making cash. China's the senior partner here. And the goal is absolutely, in my mind, yes, to make some money, but it's also to kill Americans. And they reward people who do this. In 2021, the Biden administration sanctioned a guy named Juan because he was involved in the fentanyl trade in China and in Mexico. So they put sanctions on him. Big deal. He doesn't really care. 3 months later, he gave a speech because he was given an award by the Chinese Communist Party. Gets sanctioned by us publicly for being involved in the fentanyl trade. 3 months later, the Chinese give him an award, and he gives a rousing speech where he says he's proud of what he's doing because it's helping China in its battle with the United States. So that's what's really going on here. This is a war, a chemical war on the United States. This is not your typical drug problem that we've had in the past.
Oh, and all those, I feel like I'm fairly up to speed on these things. And I learned so much reading Blood Money, especially. Like, it drives it all home. If you heard things, China, precursor drugs, getting to Mexico, and it's just kind of out there, this drives it all home. And if you were ever thinking that, it's just people talking or making assumptions or a theory, no, all annotated right here. Another one is moving the railroad, moving those things up into the United States that had a Chinese relationship. It's absolutely incredible. And also, you say half of the people who die from fentanyl overdoses are young and of military age. One U.S. government official has said this is the equivalent of removing 2 or 3 divisions of Army or Marines off the rolls every year at a time when we're having a recruitment crisis. It's absolutely, it's mind-boggling. And how did the most dangerous drug ever created become a household word in America? What makes the story even more troubling is that many politicians in the highest ranks of our government have access to all of this evidence. They don't even need access to the evidence. It's right here. It's in these books. It's open source for the most part. Imagine what's not open source and classified. Have remained strangely silent about China's deep and direct involvement in unleashing this menace. They have chosen to be willfully ignorant, complicit by indifference. That's great, by the way. They have what Churchill called vacant eyes. I mean, they are letting the equivalent of 2 or 3 divisions of Army or Marines taken off the battlefield essentially every year. Incredible.
Yeah, they are. And some of them do it, as I say, because, look, once you accept the fact of what China's doing and that it's resulting in this many American deaths every year, you can't have a normal relationship with this country. You can't say, well, we're going to worry about cultural exchanges and trade. You have to make this the center point of the relationship. And that's hugely disruptive for a lot of people. So that's part of the problem. There's a lot of go along to get along people in DC. But then you also have people in both political parties who actually have financial ties that could be at stake, and I'm gonna go ahead and name 2 of them, one from each political party, if that's all right. Yeah. The first one would be Joe Biden's family. Joe Biden. There's been a lot of reporting about Hunter Biden. We kicked that off in 2018. The Bidens have gotten tens of millions of dollars from Chinese entities. Here's the part, though, that I think is particularly relevant when it comes to the fentanyl. In 2017, they admit this, they acknowledge it, they don't dispute it. They got a $5 million forgivable interest-free loan, which they've never repaid, from a guy named Yi, a businessman named Yi, in 2017. What's troubling is that Yi at that time was business partners with a Chinese gang leader named White Wolf. That's the guy's name. White Wolf is the head of the Chinese criminal gang that set up the Sinaloa cartel in the fentanyl trade. And the Sinaloa cartel, they are the kings of fentanyl. They dominate that space. So you literally have a situation where the first family of the United States, there is 1 degree of separation between them and the people that are involved directly and profiting from the fentanyl trade. So, my question is, do they really want to have a conversation about Chinese involvement in the fentanyl trade? I don't think so. It's deeply embarrassing, and it comes very close to their their front door. So it's what they call in Washington an optics problem. The second person I would look at would be Mitch McConnell, senator from Kentucky, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate. His family has a shipping business, and back in 1993, he, as a senator, and his wife and father-in-law visited with the Chinese, and the Chinese State Shipbuilding Corporation invited them and basically set them up in a deal. And they said, hey, we'll build all these ships for you. We'll finance the construction of these ships. We'll put the crews in these ships for you, and we'll get you contracts with Chinese state-owned companies, and we'll help build your shipping business, which they did. That creates a problem, though, today, because they now have leverage. If Mitch McConnell were to call out China on this point or any other point that really pissed them off, the Chinese could destroy the shipping business overnight. And everybody involved in that knows it. That's the kind of leverage that they want over American political figures. And unfortunately, too many of them are worried about the money in their pocket or the optics of how it looks, rather than the actual people, Americans, that are being targeted and dying because of this.
It's a good thing that the voters have short memories. You cite in here Joe Biden talking in the 90s about China, and then all of a sudden becomes strangely silent on it as time goes on. Same thing with John Kerry. You cite him in the book as well. Things he said in the past, and has become strangely silent on that as well. I guess they saw a lot of catch up over there, perhaps. But it's all in here. I did want to ask you about the Opium Wars also. The history. Chinese, obviously, they have a little longer memory, apparently, than Americans do. We can't even remember something from the mid-90s. Yet the Opium Wars feature prominently in this strategy, essentially to poison America's youth. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, revenge for the Opium Wars. And President Xi hasn't quite said that, but he's come pretty damn close to saying that. Opium Wars in the 19th century were devastating on China. I mean, the short history of it is, beginning in the 1800s, China was a major prosperous power in the world. And then suddenly the opium trade came to China. And there were a lot of British and some American merchants that were involved in the trade, did huge business. Opium, of course, highly damaging, highly addictive. It reached a point where it's estimated 25%, 1 out of 4 of everybody in China was addicted to opium at the height of this. The emperor, the leadership of China, tried to stop the trade. The British Navy intervened and said, no, you can't do this. This is a legitimate commercial enterprise. And this led to what was called in Chinese history, the century of humiliation. They went from being this pretty prosperous power to being a basket case by 1900. And they blame that. And I think there's a big case to be made there. A lot of that is because of the opium problem that they had. Well, if you look at how fentanyl has been played out, it is the actual reverse. It is not drugs going into China being carried out by British merchants. It is actually Chinese companies and people connected to the CCP who are sending drugs to the United States in cooperation with Mexican organized crime. And it's having the same effect. It's making a ton of money for these people, and it's wreaking havoc on American society. And by the way, we're focused on fentanyl, but there's carfentanil. There's all these other chemicals that are coming down the pike that are even more lethal and more potent than fentanyl. So fentanyl is just the beginning. This whole area of synthetic drugs is the wave of the future, and China is at the epicenter of it. And I think the problem is going to get a lot worse in the years ahead.
I didn't know until reading this book was about China's involvement in trying to essentially poison American servicemen in Vietnam. I didn't really, I didn't have a clear view of that until I read your book. And then also in Japan, U.S. servicemen in Japan as well. Can you tell me a little bit about that, about China connection to Vietnam? Because that takes us back to the 60s.
Yeah, this was surprising to me too. Essentially the Chinese decided in the 1960s, and we know this because they talked about and bragged about it, decided in the 1960s that one of the best weapons they could deploy against U.S. troops in Vietnam was to get them hooked on heroin. And so what they started to do was to mass produce it, and it started showing up in Saigon and at U.S. military bases. And what shocked U.S. officials was the fact that it was, 97% pure heroin. The stuff on the street that was being sold in New York at the time was like 12% pure. This was 97% pure. If this was just a commercial venture, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't put that much pure heroin into it. Second thing is the price point. To buy, this in New York at the time was $10. They were selling the ultra pure stuff for less than $2 a pop to U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. It was all packaged in similar ways. It was mass produced. And Zhou Enlai, who was the Chinese foreign minister, actually bragged to Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt, and he did it to other people. He bragged and said, we have this secret weapon we're using against the Americans that's going to be more devastating than anything the Viet Cong might be doing. And we're going to re-flip the Opium Wars, and we're going to do to them what they did to us. And that's exactly what they did. And there's a lot of evidence that one of the things that accelerated, once the decision to have been made to start the withdrawal from Vietnam, one of the reasons they accelerated that retreat was precisely because the drug addiction rates were spiking in the United States. So they recognized even in the 60s that it was a potent weapon. They did the same thing to U.S. servicemen in Japan in the 1950s, according to the Japanese government. China was also selling high potent heroin to U.S. servicemen, for pennies on the dollar that it should have been going for. In other words, it wasn't just a commercial venture; it was actually a strategic poisoning of American servicemen.
Yep, and it seems like they learned a little bit each time. Got a little better at what they've been doing each time.
You're not waiting. But I appreciate you taking swings, because a lot of people wouldn't do that. A lot of people, when they're looking at China, when you're predicting wars, essentially, the future, and not 50 years when you're like, doesn't matter what you predicted back here, no one's going to remember it. But tomorrow, essentially, or a year from now, I mean, those are big swings, and you're not afraid to take those based on your analysis and your insights and your background and your experience. So I appreciate you doing that and sharing it with all of us. But considering the things that you do study, that's sometimes can be pretty dark, and we talked about a few of those today, you still consider yourself an optimist, and you stay fairly optimistic about the future. So what gives you hope?
Well, let me give you two things. Number one, let's assume that everything I'm predicting happens and it's worse. North America still looks pretty good. And what allowed the world to come out of the Dark Ages ultimately was that we had a few Arab cities who served as repositories for all the knowledge of the Roman era that had come before. And so when the world was ready for it, that information was there and we could pick up where we left off. Now, we lost almost a millennia of history to that. It was awful. The United States is going to be serving that role, but without degrading. So the U.S. will still be pushing the frontiers of knowledge while the rest of the world resets. And so while that is hideous and damaging and depressing, we're not looking at a significant quantum leap back in the human condition that we then have to claw our way back from. It's like when 30, 50 years we get on the other side of this demographic transformation and we start to reindustrialize and scale, the United States will be there with a new generation of technology that should make it all cheaper, easier, faster, cleaner, and better. So that's the worst case scenario. I can live with that.
This episode of the Danger Close podcast is brought to you by Cry Havoc. From New York Times #1 bestselling author Jack Carr. Cry Havoc, a Tom Reese thriller. Order now.
Watch a Cry Havoc teaser here, or watch another episode of the podcast here.